Hello, my name is Alex Lacey. I'm from Goldsmiths, University of London, and I'm delighted to be speaking as part of IASPM's London Calling virtual conference. I'm especially pleased to be part of week one session on multiculturalism and diaspora. So my paper today is entitled, what do you call it, Doof Doof, Articulations of Glocality in Australian Grime Music. And this paper, as it says on the tin, it looks at Australian grime practice, and it's part of a larger project that's looking at grime music's global mediation. So the way in which this form, which was initially started in the UK in the early 2000s, has been repurposed in different settings across and around the globe. This presentation is based on ethnographic research which I undertook from sort of autumn 2019 to February 2020, where I interviewed lots of artists, analysed lots of performances, and went on a trip to Australia too in January to try and get involved in the scene and get a bit of a flavour of what it's about. And what I'm trying to do today in this paper is just give an idea of the Australian grime scene, and I'm trying to map it as a global phenomenon, which means it's something which is both locally situated and globally articulating. So it's very much of its place, but it also very much sort of signifies both the UK grime scene and also its other manifestations around the world. So it's kind of distinctive from a transnational approach, where you might sort of have a typical idea of a globalised, culturally homogenising sort of thing, where especially with studies of global hip hop, they sort of look at the US and then how these forms have taken this US phenomenon and made it in a different place. But I'm looking at something which is both unique to its place, but also looking outwards as well. And to do this, I focus on lyrical content and performance practice, and I'm going to be focusing on one particular event in this presentation today. And to give you a bit of my background, my research focuses on the live performance of grime music. For the past 3 years, I did a PhD on the UK context, and my research has been moving further afield over the past year or so. And I'm also a practicing DJ in the UK with a grime collective called Over the Edge. So I'm both practitioner and researcher. To give a quick introduction to grime music, it emerged in the United Kingdom at the turn of the millennium. It's performed by MCs and DJs. In terms of its sort of sonic genealogy, it's an Afro-diasporic form that has sort of its roots in hip-hop and more profoundly in Jamaican sound system culture, but it's also very much influenced by the grounded specificities of the UK dance music scene throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, and I've indicated here forms such as hardcore, UK garage and jungle. And its most famous proponents include names such as Wiley, Dizzy Rascal and more recently Stormzy. So in order to sort of situate the Australian scene, the Australian grime scene, I thought it's important to give a brief overview of sort of hip-hop practice and dance practice more generally in Australia historically. So from the late 80s, early 90s, there was a burgeoning hip-hop scene in Australia, covered most famously by Ian Maxwell in a book from the early 2000s, and two of the main groups were Death Wish Cast and Sound Unlimited from Sydney. And according to Maxwell, he says that these artists offered a strict adherence to hip-hop's core principles as part of a commitment to the transnational hip-hop nation. So I sort of see this as an example of sort of one-way traffic from the USA, as I mentioned just before, to its elsewheres, as Bramwell and Butterworth put it quite interestingly in a recent paper on grime in Bristol. So these formers very much adhered to the elements of grime, elements of hip-hop rather, and wanted to present an affiliation to this within an Australian context. Outside of hip-hop, there's a big dance music scene in across Australia. I mean, it's a very big country, but there's engagement with dance across the continent. But interestingly, there's a real separation between hip-hop and dance music, which makes grime quite a confusing prospect. In grime music, MCs spit at a much faster pace, around 140 beats per minute, and the instrumental production is also quite rapid. So what people were kind of seeing when they heard grime initially was rave music with MCs over the top. It didn't quite make much sense. And so this is captured by Fracture, who's someone who's going to come up a lot in this presentation, who said of the sort of scenario and musical landscape that the hip-hop scene was very hip-hop and the dance music scene was their own thing. It didn't intertwine. Grime comes from garage, and we don't have that culture over here in Australia. So Fracture, he is part of a group called Smash Brothers, who are based in Melbourne, and they started making grime in Australia in the mid-2000s. But they're an interesting group because two of the members are English, which is Fracture and Scotty Hines, who moved over permanently in the early 2000s, and two members are Australian. So what you kind of have in the Australian scene at the start is a set of artists who know the protocol and know how to perform grime because they're from the UK, working with other artists who are fans of the music too. And in terms of like a 101 of Aussie grime, there are two sort of distinct scenes where grime was happening most in Australia at the outset. This is sort of mid-2000s. There's a big scene in Melbourne, spearheaded by Smash Brothers, and also in Sydney as well, with a group known as That's Them, with MCs Sam and Nebs. But yeah, so in terms of how these artists were positioning themselves, what you have is this interesting dynamic where the lack of sound system tradition and the lack of sort of UK garage, drum and bass as a thing, as much so in Australia, is the understanding of the form is coloured by DVDs and YouTube videos, which kind of act as canonical texts of legitimate practice. And then you also have artists like Fracture and Scotty offering their own insight into how you should perform grime. But also what you also have is this interesting thing where the grime in Australia is very much grounded in evocative social commentary of class dynamics and the class situation in Australia, and this is very much tied to lad rap, which is another important precursor to Australian grime. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we're dealing with. We have a genre which is being built anew in a new country, where the frames of reference are sort of hip hop and dance music. So in order to really understand what's going on, people are understanding this form by the medium of YouTube, and also through watching certain DVDs and videos and listening to certain performances. So for the paper today, I wanted to focus on a clash. Clashing is really central to grime music. It's basically a cornerstone of grime practice, and any MC worth their salt has sort of been involved in a clash over time. Clashing is very much influenced by Jamaican sound system culture, but also the practice of the dozens, the African American homosocial game of name calling, provocation, and also later manifestations such as battle rap. In the UK, Lord of the Mics is the most prestigious place for grime clashes, and it's hosted in the affectionately named Dungeon in the East London basement of Jammer, who's in this picture here from Simon Wheatley. So I thought by focusing on a central performative tenet of grime, we can see how this scenario is repurposed in an Eastern Australian setting. So the clash itself, I should mention this is the first ever clash to happen officially in Australia, first grime clash. This clash took place on January the 18th, 2020 in Melbourne, and it was sort of in a room above a vape shop in the central business district. And there was about 40 people in the room, mainly MCs and DJs, and I was there with them, and it was kind of an interesting night. So for the set itself, we had Mr. Righty from Sydney, who's originally from Brisbane but has built his career in Sydney, and Wombat, who's from Tasmania. And in advance of the clash, there was lots of journalistic build-up, coverage on various publications, and there were hype sessions too. So these hype sessions were where these artists would record freestyle videos, basically dissing the other artist, and these were sort of going back and forth up until the clash itself. So, and this quote here from Fracture kind of captures the anticipation. So I interviewed him before the clash, and he said it'll be really big for grime in Australia, and I think it's really good that it's happening, and they both got very different styles. So it's sort of like a coming of age moment for Australian grime, really. They're now having a clash, and a clash is the legitimate part of practice. So by virtue of having a clash, that scene is something which sort of validates the Australian scene. So what I want to focus on within this clash are three things. So firstly, to demonstrate an adherence to UK grime's ethical performance structure. Secondly, how artists assert a level of legitimacy through intertextual referencing to UK artists in both lyrics and their flow patterns. and also the groundedness in Australia, which I was trying to talk about, with class tensions that are raised and assertions of locality. So the first thing to note is this clash was organised almost exactly like a Lord of the Mics clash. So the clash was structured in 3 rounds. Each artist took turns for 16 bars to spit lyrics, that means perform lyrics backwards and forwards between each other, and it was very much structured and organised like you would expect in the UK. Interestingly, all productions were by UK producers, and this not only shows an outward projection of affiliation with the UK, but it's also important to note that the tracks chosen were all made famous on radio sets. So it's very much likely that these tracks were known to the artists in Australia because they were big tracks which were used on performances which were based in the UK on shows like Suspiro's The Grime Show, which is a very big space which they used. And so they were made famous on those channels, and then they were then used in this clash. So they used UK instrumentals rather than Australian tracks. And outside of that, there's also certain performative acts which the artists were engaging in, which sort of signify value and an understanding of the genre's code of conduct. So there are certain do's and don'ts and ethical sort of structures within grime, and by adhering to these, they demonstrate an understanding of what Joseph Schloss calls the internal systemicity of the scene. And this is evidenced in a variety of scenarios. They go from the very mundane, so Writer used a phone throughout the clash to remember his lyrics because for some reason he didn't quite know all of them, and this was seen as a distinct violation of expected etiquette, as we can see here in this YouTube comment, where he says one of these guys can't even remember his bars. But it also goes into far more sort of complex scenarios. So there's a lot of discussion in grime about virtuosity and a sort of reverence for complexity. So prior to the clash, Wrighty accused Wombat of using dense multisyllabic rhymes that are just really fast but don't actually mean anything. And so within sort of the UK circuit, there's a lot of sort of, I guess, humorous discussion of MCing fast and whether there's content to it or it's just someone showing how quick they can do something. And this comes across in a number of different scenarios. Most recently, there's a sitcom called People Just Do Nothing, which is based out of a fictional West London pirate radio station, and their famous MC Grinder does a flow where he just says, skipping on a rhythm because I'm skipping on a rhythm. So he's not actually saying anything, he's just doing a fast, skippy flow. So Wrighty accused him of that prior to the clash, and then in the clash itself, this came to the fore. So I'm just going to play this short clip to demonstrate what's going on.
Put a lesson in it, watch me bless them in it. You should steer clear of big words, especially if they got some essence in it. I said lesson in it. I'm about to put a lesson in it, watch me bless them with it. You should steer clear of big words, especially if they got some essence in it.
I bet that you're jealous. You can't deal with the fact that you never made it. Say you're vent for the fellas. I bet you were jealous. Yeah. I bet you were jealous. I bet you were jealous. You can't deal with the fact that you never made it. Say it, admit it. You're fucking shit. Yeah? Okay, back to my filler bars. I'm a killer with a bit of class. I'm white snap block spinning with into the yard. I'm Spanian pimp slapping the shitty ass. Back to my filler bars. I'm a killer with a bit of class. I'm white snap block spinning with it in the yard. I'm Spanian pimp slapping the shitty ass.
Okay, so what you can see here is you can see sort of a real-time provocation from Wrighty saying that all he does is spit really fast lyrics, and then Wombat deciding to draw for a lyric where he directly references that and refutes it. So he says, okay, back to my filler bars, I'm going to kill it with a bit of class, which demonstrates a knowledge of good and bad practice and just directly counteracts Wrighty's assertion. And this self-referential affront almost offers an understanding of the protocol, and this rebuttal asserts both his preeminence in the real-time computation and also signifies to the wider audience who will be watching this, because it was quite a big platform and it has over 150,000 views on YouTube right now, that he knows grime practice and he's aware of current debates around virtuosity, but he can counter that because he has a mastery of the form. The second instance which I wanted to draw attention to is the way in which artists claim to legitimacy using what Justin Williams has determined as intrageneric referencing. So artists sort of signify other performers through a variety of ways, normally through like lyrical adages or rhythmic referencing, which shows they know the form and inside out. So in the clash, a particular instance of this occurs where Wrighty adopts the flow of East London MC Esco, and this both discredits Wombat and then affirms his ties to and knowledge of UK grime. And it's interesting that he chooses Esco to do this, because Esco is both a really sort of prominent figure from early grime, so you need to know your stuff to know who Esco is. And he was made famous on the canonical DVD Practice Hours, and these particular lyrics were actually made famous on that DVD. So that's another example of the ways in which people are understanding what legitimate practice is. Furthermore, rather than choose recent artists such as Skepta and Stormzy, he's gone for sort of a deep cut, as it were. He's gone for an artist. You need to know your stuff to work with, and you can see from the lyrics here how his flow is similar to his. So it's his top boy spirit in the game, that's me losing to you, that's nah. So he cleverly inverts it to sort of bring it into the clash in that instance. Finally, I wanted to draw attention to the way in which class is articulated and the distinct elements of locality which come forward in the clash. So I want to return to, I mentioned lad rap at the start, but it's prudent to return to here just to sort of foreground. This is a precursor. So lad rap is something which also profoundly influenced Australian grime, more so than hip hop really. It's distinctly working class, has quite violent imagery, and it has its own language schema as well. This sort of form is a reflection of the socioeconomic conditions within Australia. There's quite stark wealth disparity, and I kind of isolate this within sort of John Howard's tenure, 11-year tenure as Prime Minister. And this is also covered in Neil Ryan's work on social policy in Australia, where he noted that the government's capacity to focus on the aspirations of Middle Australia had a marked effect on class politics and also the lived experience of people. So this sort of music reflected the lived experiences of people and was very overt in doing so. And I picked up a picture here of Sydney Searchers, who are a very prominent collective. So thinking of that, I want to move into an example from the clash. And this example, there are multiple examples actually of how these sort of complex intersections of class and locality were taking place in the clash. But one of the things I wanted to point to is the fact that humour is used to negotiate this quite a lot. So Wollongong based theorist Chris Gibson has noted how working class tensions in Australia are negotiated through humour, and you can see from these two quotes here, both from Wombat, and Wright is more pejorative, we'll get to that in a moment, use sort of humour to deal with these issues. And I wanted to play a clip here which also captures another aspect of this, which is how artists use place, sense of place, to assert a level of authenticity.
He says in a rap too fast, I'll slow this down for the idiot. The place that I come from ain't too lovely, that city is insidious. He grew up as a rich kid in Brisbane, what you think that he really is. You grew up as a rich kid in Brisbane, I think you're a little...
Okay, so while this is very much masked in bravado, there's nuance and complexity in these lyrical assertions. So Wombat here is accusing Wrighty of not being real, whereas Wombat is because he comes from a hard place. And obviously there's the well-worn notion of sort of keeping it real, which is perennial in hip-hop studies. But this sort of pairing with humorous aspects is something which is quite Australian, I'd argue, to an extent. And furthermore, they use place in a very sort of particular way. So Wrighty, for example, while Wombat is discrediting him for not being authentic, he decides to take umbrage with Wombat's location. So Wombat's from Tasmania, and so he decides to go at Wombat both from living with his mum and also from being a place which he perceives to be socially regressive. This is particularly topical. Tasmania public housing is in particular crisis at the moment, and it's historically been associated with high stigma in Australia, and to do with the wealth disparity that I just mentioned. So in this instance, Wrighty uses this as symbolic capital in the clash to probe into an alleged representation of Tasmania. And in one of his lyrics he says, "You're as Tassie can be, stepmom's Jackie Lambie." Now Jackie Lambie is a senator from Tasmania who's quite famous for having fairly outspoken views. So she famously advocated for a burqa ban in Australia, argued for the reinstatement of capital punishment, and also said that China might conquer Australia as part of like a communist conspiracy. So by virtue of aligning Wombat with Tasmania, he's saying, look, you're from this perceivably backwards place, so how can you even stand on your own 2 feet and war me in this clash? So there's a really interesting intersection here of rurality, the urban environment, and also class, authenticity and humour in a way that resolutely situates this performance and Australian grime more widely within the places in which it's being made. So to round up, I wanted to sort of highlight a few themes which have given a flavour of the performance character of this Australian grime practice, which principally takes place on the east coast but also in places like Tasmania too. How it pertains to the UK scene and how its own authenticity is inserted alongside the unique class and musical character of the scene. This is taking into account aspects of lad rap and the musical environment where there wasn't much examples of sound system culture which has affected the way in which grime is seen. So the first point is that there's a real adherence to regimes of value within this practice which signify an alignment with the expected protocol of UK grime practice. There's a demonstrated sense of legitimacy which is asserted through intergeneric referentiality, through lyrical adages and adoption of canonical flow styles. So the writer uses Esco's style, and he also references other rappers too throughout the clash. And furthermore and finally, there's a distinctive class character that situates this practice within contemporary Australian youth enterprise. So hopefully what I've tried to show here is that it offers an example of global cultural flow, that rather than being culturally homogenising, it's not just another iteration of grime, it's not just another iteration of hip-hop in one of its elsewheres. It's a complex intersection of grounded realities, appeals to authenticity, and mediated understandings of expected practice. Thank you very much. And if you do have any questions or queries, I'll be really happy to hear them. If you are interested in pursuing this research further, I've got a paper coming out in Global Hip Hop Studies which looks more closely at the sort of nuances and complexities of Australian grime practice. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.